Now we're going to move on to our afternoon keynote address, which is from Professor Glenn Withers. Glenn is a Professor of Economics at the Australian National University. There is a full bio in your program for today, so I'm not going to read out the whole thing. But in the migration area, he's published research on economics and policy population issues, and he has chaired the inquiry into population issues and Australia's future, and awarded an AO for his role in the development of an Australian immigration points system. If you'd like to welcome Glenn to the stage.
Thanks for that. Thanks, colleagues. I've chosen to focus a little on international education. The broader theme was education, immigration, innovation. I'll try and link those because, as we've heard in many of the earlier discussions, international students do intersect with all of those things in a number of ways in how Australia operates its international education arrangements. And in particular, though, I can draw on some recent experience at Universities Australia to try and give some background on the evolution of where we're at in international education, rather than go through the sorts of discussions that have already been engaged somewhat and will still continue to be talked about further. So rather than repeat some of the issues there, let me get straight into international education and then try and link it up. Global education is growing strongly. What we've got now is about 4 million as of 2010, and the latest estimate is probably about 5.3 million students studying outside their country of nationality. And so it's a growing component of global population movements. And why it's particularly pertinent to Australia is this is the distribution of foreign students in tertiary education by country of destination, and Australia is number 3. That is, after the US and the UK as destinations for internationally locating students, Australia comes in as number 3, which produces the sort of statistic that those of us in the sector are very familiar with, which is that about 25% of our enrolments are international students in Australia's universities, and that's the highest proportion of university students from an international background of any country. So we're number 3 in absolute numbers and highest proportionally. So we have a rather distinctive experience with the development of international education as part of our tertiary education system. Of course, it was more than universities, English language training, and also vet education, vocational education and training, were growing substantially, and schooling is also starting to grow substantially as a source of international education, but currently universities are still the dominant outlet for that. And that was reflected in what I've called here the rise and rise of Australian education exports. You can see way back in 1990 at the bottom, a modest $1 billion of export value from the monies that international students expended in coming here, to by 2010, in 2 decades, $17+ billion. So a huge change in the income associated with exports. And if I was addressing a group of Deans of Arts or a Humanities Academy conference, I probably wouldn't even mention this. I'd be held out of the room for functionalisation and commercialisation of what education should be about. However, it was fascinating, having worked as a lobbyist in Canberra for the universities, how all the talk in the world about personal development, cultural criticism, social valuation and the like just produces total deafness on the part of the politicians you're talking to. Mention that you're now dealing with the 3rd largest export industry after coal and iron ore, and they're suddenly all ears and wanting to know what you're telling them. So for the sake of giving something of the spirit of advocacy in Canberra and what they pay attention to, this is the sort of thing they pay attention to for good or ill, but you select your mark carefully so that a number of Green senators and Labor senators, and these days even crossbench senators in particular, are susceptible to a whole range of considerations in these areas as opposed to the more conventional politicians. Why did we grow such a dramatic export industry at the time? Well, one answer is that chart there, which shows the change in comparative funding over the period from 1995 to 2007, just before the GFC. The big blue block is the growth in the OECD average funding of universities. The little slab at the bottom is the modest growth in Australian funding over that period. That is, Australian universities, post Paul Keating, and Keating has a bit of a role to play in this. He was the one who suspended indexation in about 1997, and the Howard government never changed that arrangement over its period of office, meant that Australian universities were under a bigger squeeze than most OECD universities for a very substantial period. And indeed, the more successful we were as an export industry, the more finance kept taking money away, almost dollar for dollar. So we had this forced growth of international education as an export industry, and it was acceptable in the universities for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Vice-chancellors, of course, loved the money, but most academics love the notion of international cultural integration. They really enjoy the process of a disparate, internationalised group of students until, of course, the class sizes get too big, and then you start to have your qualifications and demurs. We'll come back to that. But in principle, of course, the whole notion of being part of an international, integrated educational system is something that most academics are naturally and instinctively supportive for. We also had over this period, this is the period up to 2010, hardly any change in per student domestic funding. And of course, Christopher Pyne's proposals were for another 20% reduction in that and the removal of any indexation of that into the future, so that, or at least altered indexation arrangements, such that the per student funding is not looking strong for Australian universities, even though demand-driven funding means you'll get bigger and bigger budgets, but you've got to take on more and more students, and most of those additional students actually do require improved funding, particularly if you're serious about improved SES participation in universities, where a heck of a lot of first-year mentoring and intensive work is needed to then help with that completion and continuation in the process of student progress. But compared to most countries, we've had static per student funding for a very long period. And the result is a little like has emerged in some of Mr. Pyne's negotiations at the moment, about a 30% need to cross-subsidise teaching and research from other areas, and which other area is the source of cross-subsidy? Well, you cross-subsidise your domestic students and your research from international education, as well as some other commercial sources of revenue. And that's how the Australian education system now has turned out at university level to be one of the most diverse of the public university systems in the world. We've gone from about 90% public funding to about 40% public funding, including the research funding, as a source of total university revenues. That's one of, for the public university system, it's in a sense the most privatised funding system of any. But of course, some of the US, Korean, Japanese universities that are private universities raise more money than that themselves, or about the same as that themselves. The benefit, when we talk about this growth, the benefit side is the export revenue itself. $16 billion translates into a lot of jobs being spent on Australian services, many more than the jobs that the students themselves take through their work-related activities when they're in Australia. It's also, of course, the cultural diversity that comes from that, and a whole range of downstream network effects. The particular part of the Australian National University I'm in at the moment, for instance, 3 of the Indonesian cabinet are graduates of the department that I'm in. That sort of soft diplomacy sort of effect is the sort of broader cultural influence of this sort of international education that can be quite significant. Why were we able to achieve that? Particularly since we're in universities criticised so much for being poor managers and non-entrepreneurial. Business leaders continuously sort of lambast areas like higher education and say they've got to get with it in management. But on the other hand, to develop a huge export industry within 20 years and become the 3rd largest exporter it seems to indicate that somehow we muddled through rather well for amateurs. And the sorts of reasons why we were able to was we do have a long-standing, reputable higher education system located in a developed, peaceable country. We have a range of geographic, climatic and linguistic advantages, particularly with the emerging markets of East Asia and South Asia. We do have higher education tuition fees under the current exchange rate arrangements, but we were able in a number of ways to alter admission quotas such that international students could be admitted without worrying about quota restrictions. Many countries have imposed quotas that include international students, for instance. We were very entrepreneurial in language testing and in development of student agency groups, the development of the IELTS test in conjunction with Cambridge, the development of IDP, companies like Navitas in offshore campuses and so on. Australia has been very, very innovative, and these complement in a number of ways the way we operate international education. And the visa and migration pathways and arrangements worked for a long period rather well until the Indian student problem time. But our accord of work rights, the migration pathways and so on, compared to many of our competitors, particularly the United States, were supportive of the development of this sector. And our quality assurance arrangements, much as we might complain about the dead hand of TEQSA and ASQA as a ticker box regulator and the like, those and their predecessors, such as AUQUA, gave a lot of confidence compared to other countries in the arrangements for international students studying in Australia. So these facilitated the way we have become much more integrated into the global market proportionately than any other country for international students wanting to come and study here. But we then had a perfect storm that challenged that success. We've had the rising Australian dollar for a significant period. The migration growth that was associated with a number of visa changes also started to hit hard against the students who were a source of some of that migration growth. We had some Indian student safety incidents down in Melbourne that gained huge publicity in India. Even in the 2010 election, you had, I think it was Henry before, who was quoting some of the loose statements by some of our politicians about whether we should be worrying about international student migration and indeed migration generally. We've had the global financial crisis, which affected a number of source countries, and the rise of the massive online, open online courses means people can sometimes do studies without having to leave home base. The result of all these things coming together was, after that long period of substantial expansion, we suddenly had an almost 10% decline in international enrolments in 2011, after a decade of averaging 10% annual growth. So a sudden shuddering, juddering halt, though less so for universities than vocational education and training and the English language training. The official response was pretty strong. We got a series of remarkably sensible reviews by Baird and Knight and COAG. Michael Chaney's review, though not all of that's been implemented properly. For record's sake, I guess I put in the University of Australia's 10-point plan there too, some of which was incorporated into government responses. You had the Asian Century Task Force focus on extending international education, and now Julie Bishop's particular championing of a reverse Colombo plan. So we have sought in a number of ways to make good the damage that occurred around 2009, 2010, 2011. And it's fitting in with, in a number of ways, the trends in university reform, and so we wait to see now how Mr Pyne's proposals may affect our capacity to keep implementing these changes, and indeed will they impel it further, and can we respond as we have in the past? There must be some point where your back is broken. That is Mr Pyne's reforms about further reductions in per student subsidy, and around that a whole lot of other proposals, charging fees for doctoral students and so on, domestic doctoral students, start to make for a very complex management scene that may or may not spill over into national education. We're losing our public spending share of GDP even further as we're proceeding, so you do need that external income. Whether you can achieve it, however, is going to be compromised by some of the consequences of that history. This is the rise in the student-to-staff ratio over the past 2 decades. That means more and more crowding of classes and a heavier and heavier burden on academics in providing continuous assessment and associated mentoring of students, so that how we compare with other countries such as the United States, Canada, the UK, all those European countries who are now teaching in English to try and attract international students, and the development of competitors in Malaysia and Singapore and Japan and Korea, Taiwan, all seeking to compete in the international market. If our class sizes are twice the size of others, then international students may think twice about continuing to want to come here compared to these other areas they can go to. It's now beginning to be shown up in international student experience surveys. The satisfaction rates are much higher, say, for US student experience now than in Australia. Those crowded classes, the lack of timely turnaround of staff assessments of your work and so on, the cutbacks in student amenities on campuses are starting to bite in the overall evaluations of the Australian student experience by international students. So we should recognise that we are positioning ourselves in what is a global, evolving international education scene. Yes, Europe and the USA are still a patchwork quilt after the global financial crisis. Some of them responded by re-emphasising and enhancing education as the way forward to deal with the crisis and the future requirements of their economies and societies. Others cut back dramatically on higher education. And indeed, one of the reasons, I'm sure, for that big increase in Australian recruitment of academic staff that was in one of the earlier charts you saw was the crisis in a number of overseas universities where their staff suddenly wanted to come to Australia when they didn't want to before. We still were hiring over this period because our economy was stronger. Britain, of course, is looked at closely. We're being told that the Pine proposals are sort of US imported, and they are to some extent in the directions of privatisation and competition. But actually the coalition has been in much closer contact with the UK. It works very closely with the Conservatives in the UK over policy developments in this area. They consult with each other frequently and tic-tac over who follows whose initiatives between the two countries. And so a report by Lord Brown that started to cut back on funding of humanities and social sciences and restructured research funding and so on is something that's influenced the coalition here quite substantially, as well as the spirit of North American, more privatised university arrangements. Canada's the closest to us, though, in sort of a steady capacity to get through the GFC, keep your international students happy, keep your domestic students reasonably pleased with their employment outcomes. But of course, any of these developed countries stand as retarded, if I could put it that way, compared to the Asian dynamism we observe. You know, most of us who go and visit, say, China for a brief period and then go back after being away 6 months, suddenly see whole new campuses with wonderful new medical schools that have been built in the 6 months you were away, and huge expansion in the focus on higher education. India the same, the centre of its 5 and 10 year planning, so that sort of dynamism and ambition is beginning to stand in good contrast, and it might lead, if you remember when Paul Keating responded to Lee Kuan Yew's warning that we were going to become the poor white trash of Asia if we weren't careful, and Keating responded by saying, yes, we're in danger of becoming a banana republic, and it led to a willingness to reform. Perhaps as we see the dynamism of higher education to our north, it may encourage our leaders to become a little more supportive than they have been at times and are at present over the resourcing of the tertiary education sector. And it's VET and TAFE too that are particularly knocked around. Universities are bad enough, but vocational education and training's in dire straits, as we know, particularly in places like Victoria and Queensland. If we take heed of what I think the University of Australia is currently calling a turning point, why would we do that? Well, I'm afraid, to me as an economist, I use the economic arguments. You can add other arguments, but for instance, there's a huge payoff discernible between spending on tertiary education and the growth of per capita income with due allowance for the directions of causality. This is a controlled experiment, not just richer countries spend more on higher education. Rather, you can show that spending on higher education over time and in future periods leads to expansions of per capita income. And these are the sorts of measures that we used to show to politicians about if they increased reform funding, Bradley style, for Australia, then these are the sorts of payoffs. An investment of $3 billion in 2011 would have been producing a $36 billion increase by 2020, which is actually a huge rate of return. That if you speak the language of finance, this is a 15 to 20% rate of return. And business has a hurdle, government has a hurdle rate of about 7%. Anything above 7% should be funded. And business have higher rates because of higher risks in business. They have hurdle rates of 10 or 12%. So if you're talking 15 or 20% payoffs, put aside the advance of civilization, the pursuit of truth, the love of excellence, and pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, you can get 20% rate of return as well. And this should convince treasuries and prime ministers' departments and the like. I can even remember many years ago, I worked as a consultant for the Australia Council, and Donald Horne was the chair, the late Donald Horne was the chair at the time. Di Urbary was the general manager. She commissioned David and Throsby and I, two economists, to do some work for the Australia Council. When Horne found out, he was absolutely aghast, absolutely beside himself as to the notion of somehow putting dollar values on culture. When we came up with huge dollar values that showed how big the growth of the cultural sector was and how it paid off so much in employment and exports and economic activity, very next week he was making speeches waving the numbers around. It's interesting how we can be bought, I'm afraid, sometimes. This is the economic payoff, continued illustrations of that. Why does it happen? This is the core of it on the non-research side, on the teaching and education side. Those three lines, the top line is the payoff over life of incomes received by university-educated people, on average, compared to the middle orangey line, which is people who have only a vet qualification as their highest qualification, compared to the bottom line, which is school leavers who have no further study in either vocational education and training or in universities. What you can see is that that early commitment of your time to further studies after you leave schooling pays off hugely through your lifetime, on average, not for everybody, but on average for university-trained people and for vocational education-trained people. Turns out actually the vocation rate of return is about the same as universities. You don't spend as much time in vocational education and training, and it doesn't cost you as much as a university. And as a result, in turn, you don't get quite that big increase in your lifetime income, about 1.5 million more than a school leaver that you do with a degree. But both of them pay hugely compared to not undertaking further tertiary studies. So if you are increasing the participation rates of well-skilled, well-trained people, not only hopefully are they happier people whose personal development has been enhanced so wonderfully by their study of Renaissance and Reformation history, but they've all become public servants and school teachers and social workers and nurses and engineers and doctors and architects. And the result is, of course, a very substantial increase in the number of people who are paying taxes that can fund our education and our health system and our pensions and our infrastructure into the future. So if you're wanting to solve a fiscal sustainability problem and you're worrying so much about your budget into the future, the worst thing to do is to trim back on tertiary education support. It'll help you in the short term, but it takes no account of long-term payoffs. It's real short-termism at work. And it also pays off innovation. This happens to be a chart linking high-level innovation countries with higher education expenditure as a percentage of GDP or your graduate share of population. And again, a very high, in this case, just correlation, not causation demonstrated, between those countries that spend more on higher education and their rankings in international innovation indices. And we've got a requirement from people like Catherine Livingstone at the Business Council saying that what we need to be is a more innovative country. That's what we do for the new reform era. Well, the best thing you can do for that is to support education through its teaching and research functions, particularly at the tertiary level. The payoffs are fairly uniform across the country. This is state-by-state examinations from modelling of where the payoffs come if you expand the education budget, and it's uniform around the country and regions and cities, as well as states and territories. So it's something that's not just focused on the north or the west or the southeast or whatever. It really is a uniform payoff for the nation as a whole, and this is your fiscal benefit payoff. The top line is the continued growth of average taxes being paid. The bottom line is the continued tax cost of the university system. The gap grows and grows and grows between the payoffs and the expenditures, which is why you can control your budget in the longer haul. But the catch is, for politicians who live short term, that early period in which you pay out more than you've received back, naturally enough, while people are in universities and before they've got their well-paying jobs. But what is interesting is the politicians are a little behind the public. Increasingly, when universities are doing what they should do, which is examine public opinion in well-constructed ways. So it's not the usual lobby group self-serving thing of asking a question that only allows you the answer, yes, I love universities, where you do it in a neutral context with a whole lot of alternatives and options. What you actually find is the aspirational motive for your children to be doing well and your families to be doing well into the future drives most people to say we should be, our universities are so important for our economy, our environment, and for our social opportunity, and also a growing belief in international links as another benefit from universities, though it's not quite up there yet with economy, environment and society as drivers. But a growing willingness to say, hey, we should be spending more on this, and if I have to pay more taxes or cut back on some other things, I agree, and here are the things I would cut back on, not just a general wish, but actually to go through the detail, say through focus groups, and say, all right, I'm willing to cut back here, here and here, even if I don't want to pay more taxes, and put it into this area and this area. And when you do those sort of constructed experiments in good university research, you find a willingness out there that the political parties themselves don't yet fully appreciate, I think. And when I asked pollsters in the advisory areas for ministers' offices and so on, it looks like the way in which the party secretariats construct their questions for their polling is almost, it builds in their expectations. And they're expecting there not to be votes in universities, and yet when you ask the question neutrally and right, they're wrong. And I think, from what I understand of talking to some of their pollsters, they're beginning to twig to the fact that they were prejudging an outcome and they're missing important potential votes there. And that once they realise that, they start to change. And so the public is even willing to pay some more. Half the population thinks about what we're spending now is about right, but there's another big group that say more, and there's hardly any who say cut back in this area. This is where we've got to start our savings. So this was by way of background on why we were able to grow an international education industry, why we're in trouble of compromising that success for both the international education area, but of course, and precisely at the same time, for our own domestic outcomes. That is, the same classrooms, the same teachers are teaching domestic and international students. And if we're growing the class sizes and if we're not giving appropriate, detailed, individualised attention, if we're not giving our academic staff enough time to do their research, then the edifice can come crumbling down because we could reach a tipping point, particularly as the present baby boomer generation that has carried through the universities significantly, locked in from the 1960s to being academics, as they retire, they're not being replaced. It's amazing how many academics, if I ask, would you recommend to your children they become an academic? How few say yes. Most say no. I've warned my kids off. Don't. It's just not what it used to be. Now, part of that's just the normal ageing process, but there's more to it than that. And with your indulgence, I think I've got a couple of minutes. I just want to really draw direct attention to migration linkages, though, here. You'll remember that this is a tiny little bit of history in a way. When John Howard took government, Bob Hawke had been a huge promoter of migration. Paul Keating was a neutral, it's partly a Melbourne-Sydney thing. John Howard was very Sydney. He wasn't very keen on migration in his first government, and you'll remember he cut back substantially on migration numbers. What turned him around, though, to become an even bigger booster of migration than Bob Hawke was Peter Costello and Phil Ruddock sorted out that what was worrying John Howard was not his problems over Asian migration and the battles with Hewson and the leadership and so on. He was too pragmatic for that to really guide him. He was of the view that the selection system for migration meant if you wanted to increase migration, you had to lower the quality. And he didn't want to lower the quality because that would scare the less skilled workforce from the competition from growing migrant numbers. What Costello and Ruddock apparently told him was, no, we can fiddle the selection system, and the easiest way to fiddle the selection system is give some points to international students, because they're going to settle easily, their quals will be fine, and they showed that if you altered the point system to include international students with special extra points, then actually the quality of the migration would go up. And for about 5 years after that change, which Howard accepted, 60% of the growth of migration came from international students. Now that gradually dissipated over time, because what increasingly we got to was industry then, because Howard was also very responsive to industry, and he used to increase temporary migration for a while he wasn't increasing permanent migration. But then when he increased permanent migration, independent migration started to take over, and business got annoyed. Industry wanted its immediate needs being met better than the outcomes of the university system were delivering. If lots of people wanted to be dentists and doctors, that didn't help the mining industry or the steel industry. So they wanted their own programs, and not just temporary ones, but temporary to become permanent. And so things like employer nomination and industry-derived demand for migration began to grow. And that happened a lot under Rudd and Gillard. And Australian migration continued to grow, increasingly shifting towards industry-oriented rather than, and state-oriented programs, as you know, rather than independent migration. Even under the GFC, one of the less well understood dimensions of why we rode out the GFC better than most countries was we actually sustained our migration flows over that period, including through international student numbers. And that spending and the capital those people brought actually provided about half the fiscal boost. That all the stuff we're arguing about, pink bats and school halls, migration actually contributed about half of that fiscal stimulus over that period that helped keep us out of the GFC. But out of that has come, I think, a bit of an issue over things like the relationship between the 457 visas, the pathways into permanency, and the residual role of independent migration. And that's the sort of thing we've been talking about earlier in the program. And we're going to talk, I think, now in another session about what broader policy settings might be best to go forward in addressing those issues.
Stay there for a minute and we'll just open it up for any questions.